2012 was kind of a lame year for video games. You want to talk about a real fucking game? I'll talk about a real fucking game! Sure, there were definitely more than a few good games that came out, but if we're talking about original titles and new IPs, 2012 might as well be a punchline for a really shitty joke. It was a year that, at least for me, had me bored out of my fucking mind. It kinda gets old when the next game that all your friends are playing is just another sequel to another shooter, or a sequel that completely loses touch with what made its predecessor good. I was personally sitting in an arcade playing Third Strike all year, and that was a game that came out in fucking 1999. I think what always draws me to games like Third Strike is just how mechanically sound and impeccably designed the said mechanics are. That's good game design, and it always stays interesting. 2012 had a huge lack of good and inventive game design, and it's probably the reason why I was so dismissive of all the bland shit coming out. So, did 2012 have a game of the year in my eyes? Well, yes, it did. It's not just any game to me, however. In fact, it was the sole game that saved that year in gaming for me, and got me to pay attention to modern games once more. That game is motherfucking Hotline Miami. Yes, out of all the games that came out in 2012, Hotline Miami is my absolute favorite. I have a plethora of reasons as to why that is. For one, this game actually has a narrative to it. This comes as somewhat shocking because most games developed in the same vein as Hotline Miami don't usually bother. There's a good chance that when you pick up the game, it's not for the story, but the developers were nice enough to throw a storyline in to give your actions in the game some context. The key phrase there is some context. Most, if not all, your actions have an ambiguous motive, or the game's plot doesn't make any sense, or maybe it's not supposed to make a whole lot of sense. And luckily, most evidence points towards the latter. Upon playing through the game for the first time, I noticed early on that the story of Hotline Miami isn't the primary focus, and that's probably a good thing. In Hotline Miami, you follow a silent protagonist who has incredibly violent tendencies. Most fans just call him Jacket. You start the game off in Jacket's apartment and discover a strange package with a chicken mask and a note. The directions on said note lead you to a subway station filled with Russian mobsters, and they shoot to kill. So what do you, the player, do in a situation as intimidating as this? Well, you brutally murder every mobster in the immediate vicinity, grab a briefcase with unexplained importance, throw that briefcase in a dumpster at an undisclosed location, kill a homeless man, and finally, vomit. That's just the first level, and you can bet it gets a whole lot crazier as you go on. You have strange dream sequences with 3 strange individuals who ironically wear masks just like you do. You gain a love interest in the form of a prostitute you save from a gang of mobsters. You don't find out who the villain is until the end of the game. You realize nothing quite fits together as it should, but you don't care, because despite the fact that it doesn't make sense, in the end, it doesn't have to. In fact, it's kind of refreshing to see a game that has a story as loose and crazy as Hotline Miami. It doesn't take itself that seriously, and you shouldn't either. I mean, come on, it's more than apparent that there's a lot of 80s camp here, especially with the final boss of the game. He has 2 purple panthers as pets and a blonde Russian bombshell of a bodyguard with an eye patch who wields a katana. It's fucking bonkers, and I love every bit of it. Hotline Miami, on paper, is a neo-retro twin-stick shooter set in the late 80s. However, I personally think that doesn't do the game enough justice. I would honestly say Hotline Miami is like taking Smash TV and Manhunt, grabbing a bag of cocaine, and a copy of both Commando and Taxi Driver, and throwing all of that into a blender. With all of that said, Hotline Miami is actually a cocaine-infused opera of pixelated violence and gore, and every minute of it is just as engaging as the last. It's not an easy game though. You start every level with no weapons, and you can choose a mask that slightly alters how Jacket plays. The object of every level is to kill every enemy in each room, and upon playing the first couple of levels, you notice a few very daunting things. For starters, without a weapon you can't kill enemies with one hit, but you can still kill them very fast. Your fist can knock down enemies, setting them up for one of the many unique and equally violent ground executions in the game. You can also knock enemies down by swinging doors open when they're in the immediate vicinity. Most weapons kill enemies in one hit, and all weapons can be thrown at enemies to knock them down. There are even guns, and they are about as effective as they sound. Now, despite all of this, there is one huge catch to everything I just said. Every enemy in the game, including the unique ones and the mini-bosses, can kill you in just one hit. It's a catch that gives the game a bit of a steep learning curve, but just like most notoriously difficult games out there, such as Dark Souls or Ninja Gaiden, sticking with it more often than not brings an incredibly rewarding experience. Don't get me wrong though, Hotline Miami isn't as difficult as Dark Souls or Ninja Gaiden, but it definitely has its moments, especially if it's your first time going through the game. Despite this, Hotline Miami does its best to give the right amount of power to the player, keeping the game from being unfair or too unforgiving. The masks that you unlock throughout the game are a good example of this. Hotline Miami has 26 masks to choose from, 27 on PS3, PS4, and Vita, and all of them have bonuses except for one, being Richard, which is available by default. For example, one of the more annoying special enemies in the game come in the form of dogs, but the Ted mask, which is ironically a dog mask, makes it so dogs will completely ignore you. The Tony, or the tiger mask, makes your punches kill in one hit. The Don Juan mask makes doors a lethal weapon, making enemies who get knocked down by a door a limp corpse. The Carl mask is one of my favorites because you start with a drill. Despite the fact that it only knocks enemies down, it happens to have one of the most violent and satisfying ground executions in the game, and it also nets a lot of points. Speaking of points, every level has a ranking system, and at the end of each level you get graded on your performance. Hotline Miami wants you to put yourself at risk and pull off kill chains to get high scores, so playing reserved will almost always get you a lower score. There's also a combo system. Killing multiple enemies in quick succession will give you a combo multiplier, and it's an essential mechanic to learn if you want to get an A+ on every mission. And there are 20 missions in total, so it's not like there's not enough to do here. Couple all of this together with all of the unlockable weapons, which include fire axes and machetes, and you have yourself a pretty expansive experience. There's a few things that are a little inconsistent, however. For starters, when this game launched back in October of 2012, it was a slightly unoptimized release with a plethora of bugs. Some of those bugs are still in the game, such as enemies clipping into walls, but most of them have since been patched. Hotline Miami has been improved a crap ton since release, and we have to keep in mind a very key factor here. This game was developed by just 2 people. Yes, just 2, being Jonathan Soderstrom and Dennis Wedden. With a full team of bug testers, maybe they could have released it a little more stable, but with just 2 people, it's a miracle the game wasn't released in a state similar to Batman Arkham Knight or Assassin's Creed Unity or something. 2 people made it work day one, and that is more than I can say for most AAA developers out there. It isn't just great that they were able to do that, it's fucking incredible. They even helped out the people who were having problems with torrented versions of the game. Who does that? I mean, it's probably because they wanted the game to get as much exposure as possible, whether people were playing a legitimate copy of the game or not, but that's a really bold way to do it in my book. I'm getting off track. Regardless of all of this, Hotline Miami still does have its fair share of problems, like the hospital level or the final boss fight, but any mention of them being a real hit against the overall experience would just be me nitpicking. As far as I'm concerned, gameplay-wise, Hotline Miami is a cohesive and engaging experience from start to finish. And I haven't even gotten into how well the game is presented. The presentation of Hotline Miami to some is the most important part of its design. If it didn't have multicolored neon backgrounds or tons of blood and gore or one of the best 80s synth-pop soundtracks around, it really wouldn't be Hotline Miami at the end of the day, would it? Everything about Hotline Miami is stylish down to its very core, and it really shows when you're bashing a Russian mobster's skull in with a baseball bat, while the heavy synthesizers and hi-hats fuel your murderous rampage time and time again. Sure, it might turn some people off, but do I really look like I'm interested in the next iteration of Five Nights at Freddy's? Why would I care about opening and closing doors over and over again when I can kick a door open and plaster the walls with the blood of a bunch of pastel suit-wearing gangsters? The latter sounds a lot more interesting, if you ask me. Granted, you have to be ready to die a lot, but in the end, completing a level for the first time was one of the most satisfying experiences I had in a video game for the longest time. Hotline Miami isn't for everyone, but you can bet your ass in 2012, it was exactly the kind of refreshing experience I needed.